Chapter 6. End Play for the Human Race. This chapter begins with a very sensitive and tender close-up photo of a bonobo mother lying relaxed on her back, cradling her infant on her breast. The two are looking lovingly into each other's eyes. Chapter 6.1 Summary. This sixth chapter reveals how science, the designated vehicle for human inquiry, has evaded the unbearable truth of the importance of nurturing in the development of our species and in our own lives by inventing theories about our origins that are now so dangerously dishonest they threaten the human race with extinction. Chapter 6.2 The danger of denial becoming so entrenched that it locks humanity onto the path to terminal alienation. As explained in chapters 2 and 4, the truth about the origin of our corrupted human condition and of the integrative meaning or purpose of existence were two extremely obvious truths that, until we found the compassionate explanation and understanding for both, were so unbearably exposing, condemning, and confronting that we, the human race, had no choice but to live in complete denial of them. For exactly the same reason, the truth of the importance of nurturing in both the maturation of our species and in the maturation of our own lives, how nurturing created our moral instincts, that was just described in chapter 5, has been another extremely obvious truth that has had to be denied because it too was unbearably condemning of our present unloved and unloving human condition afflicted lives. And, as we will see in chapter 7, the nature of consciousness is a further obvious truth that has also been so unbearably condemning that it too has been fiercely denied, to the extent that our conscious mind, nature's greatest creation, has been deemed an inexplicable mystery. In light of all this unavoidable denial, it is not surprising that these four great outstanding mysteries in science, of the explanation of the human condition, the meaning of our existence, the origin of our unconditionally selfless moral instincts, and why humans became conscious when other animals hadn't been solved. If you can't confront the human condition, you are in no position to find the explanation for it. And if you can't admit to integrative meaning, you obviously can't explain what the meaning of our lives is. And if you can't admit to the importance of nurturing, you are in no position to explain the origin of humans' unconditionally selfless moral nature. And if you can't confront the truth of the nature of consciousness, you are in no position to explain how it arose and what has prevented its development in other species. It is not lack of mental cleverness or Einstein-like genius that made all the great missing explanations in science that are presented in this book impossible to find, but alienation, the lack of innocent, soul-guided soundness and security of self. The truths and insights revealed in this book are, in fact, obvious and easy to find, as long as you are not living in a resigned, dishonest, alienated, human condition denying state. Cleverness was not the crucial factor in finding all these great breakthroughs in science. What was needed was simple, truthful, soul-guided, sound thinking. As Berdyaev recognized in the quote of his that was included in paragraph 237, the moral reformation of life depends on a revelation of a clear conscience, unclouded by social conventions, the most entrenched and insidious of which is denial. That exceptionally honest writer, Simone Weil, saw the problem clearly when she wrote in a 1942 essay that a new type of sanctity, a fresh spring, a new revelation of the universe and of human destiny requires the exposure of a large portion of truth and beauty hitherto concealed under a thick layer of dust, denial. More genius is needed than was needed by Archimedes to invent machines and physics. A new saintliness? The world needs saints who have genius, just as a plague-stricken town needs doctors. There is certainly truth in the novelist Aldous Huxley's observation from his 1937 book, Ends and Means, that we, resigned humans, don't know because we don't want to know. Yes, a recurring theme running through this book is that the truth cannot be found from an evasive and thus dishonest position. Living in denial of the human condition and of any truths that bring it into focus means your search for truth and understanding is only ever going to end in a completely lost state of confused madness. For instance, as we saw in Chapter 2.9, mechanistic science initially tried to deny the existence of the human condition by dishonestly claiming that our selfish and competitive behaviour was a natural consequence of a supposed survival of the fittest natural selection process, and that our selfless moral nature was actually a selfish strategy to help relatives or kin reproduce our genes. But that extreme dishonesty was both contrary to and offensive of the fact that we humans do have unconditionally selfless, loving moral instincts. And so, in response to that backlash, a much cleverer way was concocted to deny our species' extreme sickness, its psychosis. As has been mentioned, the word psychosis literally means soul illness. This contrivance was E.O. Wilson's multi-level selection theory for eusociality, which maintains there is no psychosis involved in the human condition, but that we simply have some unconditionally selfless instincts that exist alongside competitive survival of the fittest, selfish ones, and that our human condition is the product of a conflict between those two instinctive states. Yes, this theory renders the human condition inconsequential, virtually benign, with the consequence of this extremely sophisticated denial being that the human race now faces terminal alienation, madness. Indeed, if this extreme dishonesty on the part of mechanistic science had not been exposed, as it is throughout this presentation, then the stage was set for the extinction of our species. In the case of humanity's denial of integrated meaning, it was explained in Chapter 4.3 that the way the upset human race eventually found to eliminate that truth was by making the integrative theme or purpose of existence out to be a supernatural deity we termed God, a subject or realm that supposedly had no place in science. An outrageous display of dishonesty that has led to all manner of blind, purposeless, ultimately unaccountable, ridiculous interpretations of the natural selection process. And, as we will see in Chapter 7, a similar fate has also befallen the study of consciousness, which has been so characterized by denial and dishonesty that it too has resulted in the human race becoming lost in a completely bewildered state of intellectual confusion about the all-important issues of what consciousness actually is and how it emerged. And, lastly, in the case of that other key issue that is so critical to our understanding of ourselves, namely the origins of our moral nature, what will be revealed throughout this chapter is that the denial of the importance of nurturing in the maturation of our species and in the maturation of our own lives has seen the 140 years that have passed since the American philosopher John Fiske first presented the nurturing explanation for our moral nature squandered through the development of extremely dishonest, alienated, mad biological theories to explain our species' altruistic instincts. A tragic journey that has now culminated in the immensely dangerous social ecological model and its most recent incarnation, the self-domestication hypothesis. In short, what has just been outlined illustrates how, even though mechanistic science had no choice other than to practice denial of any truths that brought the issue of the human condition into focus until we found the true explanation of the human condition, such denial was an extremely dangerous practice. Yes, what has been described illustrates the dangerous trap that was described in Chapter 2.4, where, as necessary as they have been, the longer denials are practiced, the more refined they become, so that in the end, after many decades of development, they inevitably become so sophisticated, so cleverly refined, and so entrenched, they effectively lock humanity onto a path to terminal alienation, to total derangement, death, and extinction. The universal ruin to the world that Plato said more and more forgetting denial leads to. Chapter 6.3. The nurturing origins of our moral soul is an obvious truth. Like the truths of the origin of our corrupted human condition afflicted state and of integrative meaning, the importance of nurturing in both the maturation of our own lives and in the maturation of our species that nurturing created our moral instincts is an obvious truth. While we've had to live in denial of it, we all intuitively know that a mother's love is crucial to the creation of a well-adjusted human, and that we are all born with an instinctive expectation of receiving unconditionally selfless love from our mother. And it's also obvious that such powerful instincts to nurture with love and to be nurtured with love can't have come from nowhere. To be so strong in us, they must have played a significant role in our species' development. So yes, if we weren't living in denial of the importance of nurturing in human life, it wouldn't be hard to work out that our unconditionally selfless moral instincts were born out of the mother-infant relationship. While, as pointed out in paragraph 189, Charles Darwin was not a denial-free thinker who could confront the issue of the human condition, he was nevertheless a remarkably honest, truthful, and thus effective thinker who could see that our social instinct seems to be developed from parental affections, writing in Chapter 4 of his 1871 book, The Descent of Man, that the feeling of pleasure from society is probably an extension of the parental or filial family affections, since the social instinct seems to be developed by the young remaining for a long time with their parents, and this extension may be attributed in part to habit, but chiefly to natural selection. Further on in Chapter 4, Darwin affirmed his belief that the foundation of morality, our moral sense, which he said affords the best and highest distinction between man and the lower animals, is these social instincts that I have so lately, in the just referred to quote, endeavoured to show the origins of, adding that these social instincts were aided by intellectual powers that appreciate the importance of moral behaviour and the effects of habit. Earlier he had said that love, sympathy, and self-command become strengthened by habit. So, while Darwin didn't go on and develop the idea into a full account of the origins and consequences of humans' moral nature, he did canvass the idea that the natural selection of an extended, long infancy allowed parental affections, which he also refers to as maternal instincts, to develop our moral sense. He recognized the nurturing, love-indoctrinating origins of humans' instinctive moral soul. I should mention that while Darwin clearly recognized that humans have a nurtured with love, cooperative, selfless, loving, moral, instinctive heritage, even saying in Chapter 4 of The Descent of Man that the social instincts, which must have been acquired by man in a very rude state, and probably even by his early ape-like progenitors, still give the impulse to many of his best actions. Elsewhere in his writings he contradicts himself by saying, we have a divisive, evil, devilish ape ancestry, writing, for instance, that our descent then is the origin of our evil passions. The devil under the form of baboon is our grandfather, ape ancestor. So how are we to explain these contradictory positions? I'll begin the answer by pointing out that in The Descent of Man, Darwin issued a disclaimer at the beginning of the 2 chapters in which he dealt with our moral nature. At the beginning of chapter 4, before discussing the great question of the origin of the naked law and the soul, Darwin was here quoting Immanuel Kant, of our moral sense or conscience. Darwin said, "My sole excuse for touching on it is the impossibility of here passing it over." And at the very beginning of chapter 5, which is titled On the Development of the Intellectual and Moral Faculties During Primeval and Civilized Times, Darwin conceded that the subjects to be discussed in this chapter are of the highest interest, but are treated by me in an imperfect and fragmentary manner. As I explained in paragraph 189, Darwin didn't feel secure enough himself to address the human condition, which is what is required if you are to truthfully and thus effectively look into human behaviour. So despite making an attempt in The Descent of Man to look into the origins of human behaviour, it was only a tentative step in that all-important exploration. Yes, by his own admission, it was an imperfect and fragmentary attempt. Even in one of his letters, Darwin admitted that I have never systematically thought much on religion in relation to science. As explained in paragraph 925, to understand religion from a scientific basis requires recognizing that religions are at base a way of coping with the insecurity caused by the human condition. Or on morals in relation to society, the question of how selfless cooperative moral behaviour came about, and without steadily keeping my mind on such subjects for a long period, I am really incapable of writing anything worth sending to the Index, a religious publication he had been asked to contribute to. Clearly, Darwin oscillated from not being prepared personally to deal with the wider issues of man's mental evolution, as Harrison said in her quote included in paragraph 189, to attempting to tackle those issues, but only in an imperfect and fragmentary manner, because he wasn't able to, steadily keep my mind on such subjects for a long period. Darwin oscillated from attempting to do some human condition confronting, honest, effective thinking, such as recognizing that natural selection of a long infancy allowed parental affections to develop our moral sense, to complying with human condition avoiding, dishonest, mechanistic thinking by agreeing that our evil passions come from our baboon grandfather, in other words, our ape ancestors. This swinging between human condition confronting and human condition avoiding thinking was very evident when, in The Origin of Species, Darwin initially truthfully left it undecided as to whether individuals who manage to reproduce are better or fitter than those who don't, but later caved into Spencer and Wallace's suggestion to incorporate the patently dishonest human condition avoiding concept of survival of the fittest. See paragraph 195. Yet another example of this dishonest thinking occurred when, as mentioned in paragraph 203, Darwin flirted with the biologically unsound idea of group selection to explain our moral instincts. Yes, Darwin was sufficiently sound and thus capable of brave, truthful, effective thinking to come up with the idea of natural selection to explain the origin of species, but not sound enough to confront the human condition and explain the origin of human behaviour. I have written a more in-depth analysis of Darwin's thinking at www.humancondition.com/freedom-expanded-Darwin. Although the renowned anthropologist Richard Leakey wasn't thinking honestly when he wrote in his 1997 book Origins that the bond between mother and infant occurs so that her infant can have a period of prolonged learning about its environment. The dishonesty of this thinking will be explained shortly in paragraph 505. He was thinking truthfully when he then emphatically asserted that the basis of all primate social groups is the bond between mother and infant. That bond constitutes the social unit out of which all higher orders of society are constructed. In his acclaimed television series and accompanying 1973 book that was dedicated to explaining the ascent of man, the great science historian Jacob Bronowski also recognized that the real vision of the human being, of an unconditionally selfless, loving, sound, integratively behaved individual, which Christ so exemplified, is a direct product of the nurturing that takes place between a mother and her child, saying that, but far more deeply, it, a sound mind, depends on the long preparation of human childhood. The real vision of the human being is the child wonder, the virgin and child, the holy family. It's true, the family, especially the virgin, uncorrupted, soul intact, innocent, psychologically sound and secure mother and child, is holy. That bond does lie at the heart of what makes us and made us as a species truly human, namely loving and cooperative. Yes, the crucial role played by the nurturing, loving bond between mother and infant in the ascent of man is a truth we are all intuitively aware of. That awareness is apparent when, for example, Africa is described as the cradle of mankind. Africa is where humanity was nurtured into existence. Similarly, when the anthropologist Lauren Isley wrote in his 1959 book, An Evolutionist Looks at Modern Man, that man is born of love and exists by reason of a love more continuous than in any other form of life. He was recognizing the truth that humanity was born of love. In fact, the nurturing explanation for our extraordinary, unconditionally selfless, all-loving, social, moral, instinctive self or soul is so obvious that only 3 years after Darwin tentatively ascribed the origin of our social instinct to parental affections, it was put forward as a developed theory by the aforementioned philosopher John Fiske in his 1874 book Outlines of Cosmic Philosophy, based on the doctrine of evolution. Indeed, if we were to prioritize the information we humans need to truly understand our world and our place in it, the first item would be to explain the origins of the variety of life, which is what Darwin did with his idea of natural selection. And the second would have to be to explain the origins of the particular variety of life that is the cooperative organism we call humanity, which is what Fiske did with his nurturing explanation for our species' original, instinctive, unconditionally selfless, loving, moral, social sense. However, while both these fundamentally important insights were made available to us way back in the mid-1800s, the only one we have been taught at school and university was Darwin's idea of natural selection. It wasn't until 2004, when I chanced upon a comment about Fiske, that I learnt of his remarkable contribution, which was many years after I'd worked out that nurturing was the obvious explanation for our moral instincts. As I have already pointed out, I first presented the nurturing love indoctrination explanation that is described in Chapter 5 to the scientific community in 1983 in a submission to Nature journal. I have submitted it elsewhere many times since, but to no avail, with each submission either rejected or ignored, something I will talk further about in Chapter 6.12. The trail I followed in 2004 that led me to Fiske began with a reference in a 1992 paper by the linguist Robin Allott to human love evolving from the mother-infant bond. Following the source provided for this concept directed me to the work of the scientist and evangelist Henry Drummond, via the historian Dorothy Ross, who had written that to Darwin's principle of natural selection by means of the struggle for survival, he, Drummond, added another principle that he considered far more important, the struggle for the life of others, or altruistic love, which developed in the course of evolution from the necessities of maternity. Going then to the 1894 writings of Drummond, in his book The Ascent of Man, I found that in responding to the question as to why humans have such long infancies, Drummond had written that the question has been answered for us by Mr. John Fiske, and the world here owes to him one of the most beautiful contributions ever made to the evolution of man. We know what this delay means ethically. It was necessary for moral training that the human child should have the longest possible time by its mother's side. Progressing then to Fiske, in 1874 he had written in his book Outlines of Cosmic Philosophy that throughout the animal kingdom the period of infancy is correlated with feelings of parental affection. The prolongation of infancy must have been gradual, and the same increase of intelligence to which it was due must also have prolonged the correlative parental feelings, by associating them more and more with anticipations and memories. The concluding phases of this long change may be witnessed in the course of civilization. Our parental affections now endure through life. I believe we have now reached a satisfactory explanation of sociality. The prolongation of infancy was not, however, due to the increase of intelligence. Rather, as will be explained in Chapter 7.3, the prolonged infancy and its nurturing of selflessness liberated the fully conscious, intelligent mind, which only developed strongly after the love indoctrination process was well established. This is evidenced by the emergence of the large brain that appears in the fossil record of our ancestors after the stage when we resembled the existing non-human great apes. Nevertheless, nurturing parental affection was put forward by Fiske as a developed theory to explain human loving, altruistic, ethical, moral, social instincts way back in 1874. I might mention that Charles Darwin sent this wonderful tribute to John Fiske in a letter to him in 1874. I never in my life read so lucid an expositor, and therefore thinker, as you are. Since Drummond has provided us with an absolutely wonderful description of Fiske's nurturing explanation for our moral nature, the following is a condensation of that 1894 account from his aforementioned book, The Ascent of Man. The pinnacle of the temple of nature is the mammalia, the mothers. It is that care for others from which the mammalia take their name. All elementary animals are orphans. They waken to isolation, to apathy, to the attentions only of those who seek their doom. But as we draw nearer the apex of the animal kingdom, the spectacle of a protective maternity looms into view. The love of offspring. That early world, therefore, for millions and millions of years, was a bleak and loveless world. It was a world without children and a world without mothers. It is good to realize how heartless nature was till these arrived. The ethical effect of this early arrangement was nil. There was no time to love, no opportunity to love, and no object to love. Now, before maternal love can be evolved out of this first care, nature must cause fewer young to be produced at a birth, make them helpless, so that for a time they must dwell with her, and she dwell with them. In this mammal child, infancy reaches its last perfection. On the physiological side, the name of this impelling power is lactation. On the ethical side, It is love. Millions of mothers had lived in the world before this, but the higher affections were unborn. Tenderness, gentleness, unselfishness, love, care, self-sacrifice, these as yet were not, or were only in the bud, to create motherhood and all that enshrines, required a human child. The only thing that remains now is that they, human mother and child, shall both be kept in that school as long as it is possible to give affection time to grow. No animal except man was permitted to have his education in love thus prolonged. We know what this delay means ethically. It was necessary for moral training that the human child should have the longest possible time by its mother's side. A sheep knows its lamb only while it is a lamb. The affection in these cases, fierce enough while it lasts, is soon forgotten, and the traces it left in the brain are obliterated before they have furrowed into habit. Note here recognition that the training in love wears off with age, which, as was explained in chapter 5.9, is why there was the selection for neotenous youth in the love indoctrination process. To her, the human mother alone was given a curriculum prolonged enough to let her graduate in the school of the affections. Unselfishness has scored. Its child has proved itself fitter to survive than the child of selfishness. A few score more of centuries, a few more millions of mothers, and the germs of patience, carefulness, tenderness, sympathy, and self-sacrifice will have rooted themselves in humanity. However short the earliest infancies, however feeble the sparks they fanned, however long heredity took to gather fuel enough for a steady flame, it is certain that once this fire began to warm the cold hearth of nature and give humanity a heart, the most stupendous task of the past was accomplished. And here Drummond quotes Fiske. From of old we have heard the monition, except ye be as babes, ye cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. The latest science now shows us, though in a very different sense of the words, that unless we had been as babes, the ethical phenomena which give all its significance to the phrase kingdom of heaven would have been non-existent for us. Without the circumstances of infancy, we should never have comprehended the meaning of such phrases as self-sacrifice or devotion. The outstanding question, it follows, is why did Fiske's fundamentally important explanation for the origins of our moral instincts that created humanity, one of the most beautiful contributions ever made to the evolution of man, virtually vanish from scientific discourse? Why weren't we taught the nurturing explanation for our altruistic moral nature at school? Or when we studied biology at university? Why did I have to work the idea out myself? Why was this altruistic principle that was considered far more important than the principle of natural selection, and which Fiske explained was able to be developed in our forebears by the necessities of maternity, allowed to so disappear from biological discourse that, in the 140 years that have elapsed since Fiske presented his explanation, a veritable mountain of books have been published presenting all manner of unaccountable, dishonest theories for the origins of our species' extraordinary moral nature. Why, when we had the truth, has there been such a colossal amount of tragically misguided effort that, as we will see, has now resulted in the dangerously dishonest, misleading, social, ecological, or self-domestication explanations for our moral soul? And why, in turn, has my nurturing love indoctrination explanation for our moral soul, and indeed all my work, not just been rejected and ignored, but, as I will document in chapter 6.12, so ruthlessly attacked that I was made a pariah, and those helping disseminate these insights ostracized? Chapter 6.4. The problem has been that the nurturing origin of our moral soul has been devastatingly, unbearably, excruciatingly condemning. As mentioned in Chapter 5.7, the answer to all these whys is that the nurturing explanation for our moral soul has been devastatingly, unbearably, excruciatingly condemning of humans' present inability to nurture children with the real, unconditional love that their instincts expect. Indeed, in his aforementioned paper, Allott noted that when the nurturing explanation for our moral instincts was put forward by Fisk and supported by a few others, it attracted a good deal of opprobrium, abuse. But, as I also pointed out in Chapter 5.7, since the upset state of the human condition emerged some 2 million years ago, no child has been able to be given the amount of love its instincts expect, and unable, until now, to explain the human condition and thus provide the explanation for why this provision of love has been so compromised, the human race has had no choice but to deny the role nurturing has played in the development of humanity and in the maturation of our own individual lives. The great difficulty we have admitting the importance of nurturing in human development is evident in the comments that were referred to in Chapter 5.7 that the biggest crime you can commit in our society is to be a failure as a parent, and people would rather admit to being an axe murderer than being a bad father or mother. And that, for a lot of women, the only really important anchor in their lives is motherhood. If they fail in a primary role they feel should come naturally, it is devastating for them. To these two comments, I might add these others that, read one after the other, capture the full horror of the difficulties and consequences of parenting under the duress of our alienated, soul-estranged, insensitive, loveless human condition. And just a reminder that the source of these quotes can be found in paragraph 491 in the written version. Firstly, from the child's point of view, in 1952, John Steinbeck wrote, "The greatest terror a child can have is that he is not loved." In 1971, Philip Larkin wrote, "They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you." And this 2014 newspaper article, "There is no great event I can pinpoint, just years of feeling unknown by my mother. She doesn't have the language of emotional connection." And from the parent's point of view, the following quotes are from newspaper reports. "Parents who fail to produce a well-adjusted child carry a terrible burden of guilt. Ultimately, you are only as happy as your most unhappy child." And finally, with regard to the overall effect, "The greatest chasm between two people is love withheld by a parent." And this revealing joke: "Be sure to have at least 4 kids. Why? So you'll have at least 2 you can talk about." These quotes are remarkable in their honesty. In fact, in my 40 years of constant thinking and writing about the human condition, I've only been able to assemble a small collection of such rare occasions when the human condition avoiding, denial practicing, dishonest world we live in momentarily dropped its guard and let some truth through. The following 2 passages are cases in point. They are by far the most honest admissions I've come across of both the importance of nurturing in human life and the now dire inability of mothers to adequately nurture their children due to the corrupting effects of our species' heroic search for self-understanding. Firstly, consider this quote from the author Olive Schreiner that also featured in Chapter 5.7. "They say women have one great and noble work left them, and they do it ill. We bear the world, and we make it. The souls of little children are marvellously delicate and tender things, and keep forever the shadow that first falls on them, and that is the mother's, or at best a woman's. There was never a great man who had not a great mother. It is hardly an exaggeration. The first 6 years of our life make us. All that is added later is veneer. The mightiest and noblest of human work is given to us, and we do it ill. Then there is this powerful extract from the anthropologist Ashley Montagu's extraordinarily honest 1970 paper, A Scientist Looks at Love. Love is, without question, the most important experience in the life of a human being, one of the most frequently used words in our vocabulary. Yet, love is something about which most of us are still extremely vague. There is a widespread belief that a newborn baby is a selfish, disorganized, wild creature who would grow into a violently intractable savage if it were not properly disciplined. However, the newborn baby is organized in an extraordinarily sensitive manner. He does not want discipline. He wants love. He behaves as if he expected to be loved. And when his expectation is thwarted, he reacts in a grievously disappointed manner. There is now good evidence which leads us to believe that not only does a baby want to be loved, but also that it wants to love. All its drives are oriented in the direction of receiving and giving love. If it doesn't receive love, it is unable to give it, as a child or as an adult. From the moment of birth, the baby needs the reciprocal exchange of love with its mother. It has, I believe, been universally acknowledged that the mother-infant relationship, perhaps more than any other, defines the very essence of love. Survival alone is not enough. Human beings need and should receive much more. We now know that babies which are physically well nurtured may, nevertheless, waste away and die unless they are also loved. We also know that the only remedy for those babies on the verge of dying is love. The infant can suffer no greater loss than the deprivation of the mother's love. There is an old Eastern proverb which explains that since God could not be everywhere, he created mothers. Maternal rejection may be seen as the causative factor in every individual case of neurosis or behaviour problem in children. Endowed at birth with the need to develop as a loving, harmonic human being, the child learns to love by being loved. To love one's neighbour as oneself requires first that one must be able to love oneself, and the only way to learn that art is by having been adequately loved during the first 6 years of one's life. As Freud pointed out, this is the period during which the foundations of the personality are either well and truly laid, or not. If one doesn't love oneself, one cannot love others. To make loving order in the world, we must first have had loving order made in ourselves. Nothing in the world can be more important or as significant. Love is demonstrable. It is sacrificial. It is self-abnegative, self-denying. It puts the other always first. It is not a cold or calculated altruism, but a deep, complete involvement with another. Love is unconditional. Love is the principal developer of one's capacity for being human, the chief stimulus for the development of social competence, and the only thing on earth that can produce that sense of belongingness and relatedness to the world of humanity, which is the best achievement of the healthy human being. Scientists are discovering that to live as if to live and love were one is the only way of life for human beings, because, indeed, This is the way of life which the innate nature of man demands. We are discovering that the highest ideals of man spring from man's own nature, and that the highest of these innately based ideals is the one that must enliven and inform all his other ideals, namely love. Contemporary scientists working in this field are giving a scientific foundation or validation to the Sermon on the Mount and to the Golden Rule, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, to love your neighbour as yourself. In an age in which a great deal of unloving love masquerades as a genuine article, in which there is a massive lack of love behind the show of love, in which millions have literally been unloved to death, it is very necessary to understand what love really means. We have left the study of love to the last, but now that we can begin to understand its importance for humanity, we can see that this is the area in which the men of religion, the educators, the physicians and the scientists can join hands in the common endeavour of putting man back upon the road of his evolutionary destiny from which he has gone so far astray. The road which leads to health and happiness for all humanity, peace and goodwill unto all the earth. But while these quotes are incredibly honest, with understanding of the psychologically upset state of the human condition finally found, the explanation of which was presented in Chapter 3, we can at last explain what is, in fact, fundamentally wrong with what Schreiner and Montague have written, which is that rather than loving our infants, being the mightiest and noblest of human work, and of there being nothing in the world more important than being loved, the incursion of the human condition saw a mightier and more important task assigned to humans, which was to persevere with humanity's corrupting, love-destroying search for knowledge, until we found the understanding that would finally liberate the human race from that condition and allow the practice of nurturing to once more regain its place as the mightiest and noblest of human work. So there has been a very good reason for why humans have literally been unloved to death, but until we could compassionately explain that reason, we had no choice but to leave the study of love to the last. It is only now that we can explain the human condition, explain that humanity has had to be preoccupied with its soul-corrupting, love-destroying, anger, egocentricity and alienation-producing heroic search for knowledge, that we can explain why we have been so alienated as parents that we have been unable to give our offspring anything like the alienation-free, sound, secure, unconditional love needed to create the real vision of the human being, of the sound child, the child wonder. Yes, it is only now that we can afford to admit that the playwright Samuel Beckett was only slightly exaggerating the brevity today of a truly loved, soulful, happy, innocent, secure, sane, human condition-free life when he wrote in his 1955 book, Waiting for Godot, "They give birth astride of a grave. The light gleams in an instant, then it's night once more." Or that the psychiatrist R.D. Laing was right when he wrote in his 1967 book, The Politics of Experience and the Bird of Paradise, that to adapt to this world, the child abdicates its ecstasy. Such is the enormous paradox of the human condition. We humans appear to be horribly bad, but are in fact heroically wonderful. But until that reconciling biological understanding was found, we had no choice but to be prepared to create and live in a world that was devoid of truth and love. As the song The Impossible Dream described this predicament, we had to be prepared to march into hell for a heavenly cause. So what is really needed to balance Schreiner's and Montague's honest but unfairly condemning revelations about how inadequate parents have been in their ability to provide their children with the unconditional love their instincts expect, and, as a result, how hurt and alienated children have been, is a presentation emphasizing just how incredibly, amazingly, extraordinarily heroic all parents have been to have even had children while they were living under the horrific duress of the human condition. Yes, a balancing presentation was needed, which this book now supplies, about how the human race has had to live with 2 million years of unjust condemnation, about how every day humans have had to get out of bed and face a world that, in effect, hated them, that considered them to be horrible mistakes, blights on this planet, defiling, bad, awful, even evil, sinful creatures, when, as explained in Chapter 3, humans are nothing less than the heroes of the whole story of life on Earth. It follows, then, that there has been a justifiable reason for each of the whys listed earlier, except for the last one of why I and those advocating my work have been so thoroughly persecuted for presenting the nurturing explanation for our moral instincts. As emphasized, it was only when we could explain the human condition, and thus finally understand our inability to nurture our offspring, that it would be safe to admit the critically important understanding of our species' nurtured origins, and, as Montague said, put man back upon the road of his evolutionary destiny from which he has gone so far astray, and restore health and happiness for all humanity. And since it is precisely that explanation of the human condition that I have presented, inclusive of that nurturing explanation, there is no justification for the rejection, ostracism, and persecution I have been subjected to. Quite the reverse, in fact. Such a response represents the very height of irresponsibility and an abuse of science's mandate to support endeavours that seek to understand and ameliorate the plight of man. The seriousness of this ill treatment will be revisited shortly in Chapter 6.12. From the perspective, however, of mechanistic science, this need to deny the importance of nurturing in our human origins until we could explain the human condition has meant that biologists had to find some way of supporting this denial. And, as we are now going to see, this need to deny the truth that our distant ancestors lived and nurtured with love all loving life, which led to the corruption of Darwin's idea of natural selection into a survival of the fittest process, through to the development of E.O. Wilson's dishonest multi-level selection theory for eusociality to deny that we lived an all-loving existence, also led to the dishonest social intelligence hypothesis to deny the nurturing with love origin of that all-loving life. Obviously, the entire need for denial should have been eradicated 30 years ago when I first presented the nurturing explanation in accompaniment with the explanations of the human condition. But, again, that is an issue I will return to in Chapter 6.12.